Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for providing me with this opportunity to talk at the Berlin Economic Forum and share my thoughts on something that obviously not just me, others as well, consider of utmost importance for the viability of the financial markets in Southeast Europe. Of course, not just Southeast Europe, because what I'm going to share with you, well, it focuses on Southeast Europe and it addresses certain structural issues in that part of the world, but it's also very pertinent for the rest of the world. But unlike the Western world, Southeast Europe has some unique characteristics, one of which is the dependency of the enterprises in that part of the world on fewer forms of financing, namely bank financing, which is mostly, which takes like 99% of the funding of small and medium-sized enterprises in our countries. Over the recent years, there have been many surveys conducted on the ways the small and medium-sized enterprises fund their operations. Those surveys differ from one another in terms of methodology, in terms of scope, and as a result, they produce different figures, but all of them reach to the same conclusion, that the small and medium-sized enterprises are actually underfunded, severely underfunded. As a result of those numerous researches and surveys, actually the policymakers in our part of the world started thinking about the way they can support the SMEs in providing more diversified set of funding sources. They launched numerous programs. Not all of them, of course, focus on funding, but in providing more and more differentiated support to the SMEs. There are numerous databases. There are national bodies that are in charge of supporting SMEs one way or another. And as a result of these surveys, they established even further initiatives and started supporting them in another way. For instance, at least in Bulgaria, we set up a program that will allow the SMEs to fund their expenses when they go public, and it will be funded by the European structural funds. This is just an example of what the individual countries are trying to do, but somehow it's still not sufficient, and the SMEs still rely on bank debt. It's pretty obvious that when you have just one source of funding, your capital structure won't be optimized, and as a result, your profitability won't be optimal as well. That is why those initiatives were accepted, but they had very limited success in diversifying the funding opportunities of the small and medium-sized enterprises. For developing economies, there is one more implication, and it's actually the dependence of small and medium-sized enterprises on commercial debt and the intercompany indebtedness. Actually, in some countries, the intercompany indebtedness is like a tangled ball. Everyone owes money to everyone. If you're a small-sized company and you rely on collecting your debt in order to repay your debt to other creditors, then this is kind of a gridlock in a certain sense, and creates numerous implications for the ongoing operations of the small and medium-sized enterprises. The needs for further measures was actually recognized by the European Commission, and 2015, it launched the concept of the Capital Markets Union, which is one of the building blocks of the free market of the European Union. Ultimately, it was aiming at eliminating all borders for the free flow of capital, including the national borders as well, so that €1 is equally investable on a cross-border basis then it is also investable, the weight is investable domestically. Of course, free flow for capital of SMEs is impeded by many factors, one of them being the home bias. The citizens of one country will have preference to invest on their domestic markets. But more or less, the Western world is changing. I don't see any reason why the eastern part of the European Union won't change. There are numerous examples in Western Europe when small and medium-sized enterprises are being funded by the neighboring countries, which is exactly the goal of the Capital Markets Union, while this is not yet the case in Eastern Europe. Over the years, or since 2015, the Capital Markets Union actually underwent a few revisions, and many of the measures changed over time, but the SME financing and the SMEs in principle remains one of the cornerstones of the Capital Markets Union. And in my personal opinion, this is the most productive and the most needed element of the Capital Markets Union. We need to remain focused on SMEs because there is definitely a problem there, and it should be addressed in a proper way. It hasn't been addressed now, but it should be addressed by the Capital Markets Union. That is why, on a side note, maybe just a little digression from the main topic. In 2017, actually, the Capital Markets Union underwent the so-called midterm review, which is, in my opinion, a little bit early, and SMEs are quite a long shot. If we are about to produce a certain set of regulations that will supposedly produce certain results, those results will come in many years. You can't estimate properly what will happen just by adopting a few regulations, and it should be noted that some of the regulations are not effective yet. For instance, one of the most important parts of it is the prospectus regulation. It will become effective in 2019. So in my opinion, the European Union is a little bit impatient to see any results, but they would come in many years' time. And it should be noted also that just by producing regulation, you can't produce complete results. In many aspects, the regulations are just following the trends, and when certain trends produce results, it may sometimes it may turn out that actually the regulations are supposed to regulate something that is no longer relevant. So on top of the regulations, I think we need to create the certain incentives, economic incentives for the SMEs in order to see the complete results. But if there is a funding gap as indicated by those surveys, how big is it? That's the question. That's a very difficult question to answer, and there are more than just one answer depending on where you look at. According to the most recent piece of paper that I read on SME funding gap, that was an IFC, a report produced by the International Finance Corporation. The SMEs all over the world, in all developing countries, I think there were 46 countries covered by that report, face a shortage of up to $4.5 trillion US. Most of those $4.5 trillion could be attributed to the high demand for capital in China and Brazil being the largest emerging economies. And as a result, the high demand for capital actually leads to a greater gap. But in relative terms, as measured by the proportion, as measured against each country's GDP, the figures are the following. For Bulgaria, the capital shortage is $6.5 billion US, or that's 13% of the GDP of our country. Please note that the market cap of the Bulgarian stock exchange currently stands at $6 billion US. So if we assume that the entire shortage is funded through the stock exchange, that means that the market capitalization of the stock exchange would double overnight. For Romania, that's 45.9 billion US dollars, or 26% of the GDP of Romania. This is twice the size of Bucharest Stock Exchange. For Serbia, it's 28% of the GDP, or 10 billion US dollars. For Croatia, it's 19% of the GDP, or 9.5 billion US dollars. Another approach towards measuring the funding gap has actually been developed by the Organization for Economic Cooperation or Development, or OECD. It's called the Scoreboard for Financing SMEs and Entrepreneurs, which is a very robust framework for data collection, processing, reconciliation, analysis, and benchmarking. While the figures are very different because the countries in Southeast Europe are actually not members of OECD, I think only Serbia is. The results are not comparable to what actually the IFC report is saying, but another very curious trend should be outlined. Actually, OECD scoreboard indicates that the new lending to SMEs actually declined in 2010-16, which means that the new credit is being taken in order to repay existing credit, and to a certain extent, some of the existing credit just matured and it was repaid. But new credit is not being produced for new project, which is a little bit disturbing. Another interesting phenomenon that was outlined is also the effects of the transition towards digital economies. That type of transition is actually a barrier in a certain sense for some companies to obtain adequate financing. The emergence of those highly innovative companies with revolutionary products very often is impeded because of their overall inability to obtain bank credit. To a certain sense, the financial industry actually lags behind the trends that are imposed by the digital economy. Most of the time, the banks require sufficient collateral, and when you have a company and just an idea, and that's your only asset, for obvious reasons, you won't be able to obtain bank financing. Yesterday, I actually read an article in one of the Bulgarian financial newspapers on a very innovative young company, although it's not a startup. It has been into existence for 3 or 4 years. And they are actually one of the 2 companies in the world that currently produce, actually, they completed their R&D activities. They produce drones for transportation of cargo up to 250 kilograms over large distances, up to 2,500 kilometers. While this is obviously not very pertinent for a country like Germany, for instance, where the road network and the railway network is quite developed, is also it will be a very good opportunity for Africa, for instance, where the road network is obviously not present. And what they shared was actually that if transporting 250 kilograms of cargo would, in Africa, probably by car would take 3 days, but with this drone, it would take just 7 hours. So it's a kind of a revolutionary product for certain parts of the world. But obviously, they were not able to obtain bank financing. They obtained private equity in one of the Bulgarian private equity funds. The new technologies also have implications on the way financial markets operate in principles. I'm not going to speak about cryptocurrencies. I'm just going to tell you that I'm overly pessimistic about those currencies, but the underlying blockchain technology is a great asset, and it have the potential to transform the way financial markets operate. It is more pertinent for clearing and settlement and for general meetings of shareholders because it eliminates the reconciliation procedures that accompany each transaction concluded on the stock exchange. But as long as some of the platforms or the technology has the ability to underlie certain platforms that connect investors and companies, it will have the power to to create platforms that may circumvent the existing stock exchanges. Stock exchanges bring supply and demand for capital, but the blockchain can do this in a very effective way, which will be an alternative to the traditional stock exchanges. For one part of them, it's not an issue, because when it comes to the Western European powerhouses, they rely on speed, and blockchain can't provide speed. There can't be no high-frequency trading. You probably heard about high-frequency trading, and the blockchain cannot achieve this, but it has the power to create a platform that brings together supply and demand for capital, and in this sense, it has the power to transform the existing exchange-operated platforms, especially when it comes to small and medium-sized enterprises, which normally raise less money from fewer investors, and when speed is not an issue. Another important aspect that I would want to touch upon is the constantly increasing regulatory requirements on stock exchanges, on investment firms, and to a certain extent the institutional investors. The regulatory grip recently, or over the past 5 or 10 years, has become so tightened that it has actually led exchanges to what is called operational leverage, to a very high operational leverage. In order to run an exchange, and my colleagues from the rest of the exchanges can confirm this, you have to create the necessary infrastructure. It comes at a certain cost. These are the so-called fixed costs of running exchanges. When the regulatory grip tightens, actually, these costs rise as well. And when you start losing business as a result of the SMEs being funded in alternative ways, then actually this creates a huge imbalance between revenues and costs. So in order to be able to sufficiently perform their functions, the exchanges should find a balance between costs and revenues. And in other words, the regulatory grip shouldn't be that strong. As another example of regulations and how they affect the equity markets, I would like to mention about the recent Markets in Financial Instruments Directive 2, the so-called MiFID II, which also has certain implications for small and medium-sized enterprises. Among the many things that MiFID II is, it actually introduced a new definition for small and medium-sized enterprises. In addition to the traditional definition that measures each company against its sales, revenues, assets, and number of personnel, actually it introduced an additional definition which says that small and medium-sized enterprise is every company that has market capitalization less than 200 million euro. On my exchange, as a result of that updated definition, it turned out that there are just 5 companies that are not SMEs. And this is pretty much the same case, all right? This is pretty much the same case with the rest of the exchanges in the region, and my colleagues can confirm that. As a result of that, 70% of our market cap is actually created by SMEs, and they account to 80% of the trading of our trading volumes. But if there is a funding gap, what are the reasons? On one hand, we have a huge shortage of capital. On the other hand, there are exchanges that are supposed to bridge that gap, but something is missing. What is it? It's first the lack of awareness. This is not my thoughts on that. This has been identified by OECD. So first is the lack of awareness and negative perception of equity-based funding. The second comes the lack of financial skills and strategic visions of companies' management, regulatory ambiguity and higher entry-level barriers, and limited exit options. How can the exchanges address those issues? Obviously, they can't address all of them, but they definitely can do something about them. First, I think the exchanges must position themselves throughout the entire life cycle of each company, from the early stage startups to the mature listed companies. This way, they will be able to support each company while it grows in size, starting with the crowdfunding platform. I'm not saying that the exchanges should run crowdfunding platforms, but they at least can partner with one. So they can get into the focus of each company's management from its inception to its mature years. This is like having a mentor from the kindergarten till you graduate. If the companies actually perceive the exchanges as a trusted and reliable partner, they will stick to them over the years. After crowdfunding platforms come the venture capitals and the private equity funds. I'm not saying that the exchanges should be venture capitalists or run private equity funds, but at least they can partner with them. There are numerous examples in Western Europe, although there are none in Eastern. Another substitute will be launching a private market, which actually is allowed under the European regulations. Companies can raise capital up to €1 million without publishing a prospectus. The prospectus is the document that you need in order to show to the public what kind of company you are and what you will use the proceeds for. And with very lightweight disclosure requirements, the exchanges can launch such platforms, and they, without any further costs, by the way, they can utilize their existing infrastructure. Next come a new type of trading venue. These are the so-called small and SME growth markets. They are, again, a result of the Capital Markets Union and allow companies to raise up to €25 million with a prospectus, but with a simplified prospectus, which means that the companies will be able to still remain focused on what they do, but provide at the same time some basic information to investors. And last is, of course, the mature exchanges, where there are no limitations apart from the ability of the investors and their willingness to subscribe any issue placed by a small and medium-sized company. So in a nutshell, I think that the exchanges should be present throughout the entire company life cycle. This is like making a very long-term investment in their future. While it's quite debatable whether having a crowdfunding platform is a profitable investment, having a large listed company on your equities market definitely is. So by supporting the small and medium-sized companies as they grow, actually the exchanges make an investment in their own future. And by supporting the SME companies, actually, from the very beginning, the exchanges also make an investment in the future of their local economies. The SMEs are the future of our local economies. With that, I'm going to conclude. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ivan. I would like Ivan to stay for a few moments in case there are any questions. Yes, please.
You said that the Eastern countries are out the capital market union.
No. The members of the European Union in the members of the European Union in the SCE region, these are Bulgaria, Greece, Romania, Croatia, and Slovenia are part of the Capital Markets Union. The rest that are currently outside the European Union, they obviously can't benefit from it.
But you said, if I may,
yeah, please.
Will it in reality deliver lower costs, or is it the reality that it will be lower cost?
Which will come at lower cost.
Or when you rent money, when you use money?
Capital cost.
Well, having more diversified funding opportunities will reduce your cost. It's one, when you rely on bank funding, obviously, you can't optimize your capital structure. And at a certain point, you won't be able to obtain additional funding from the banks just because your indebtedness will be quite high. That's very important to have an equity or equity-like funding options, sorry.
Yes, sir.
So during your lectures, you mentioned two very interesting things. One of them is reloading, you know.
Mhm.
Well, Basel III demands very high adequacy of capital, especially for Eastern countries. That increases the rate of loan.
Yep.
Because of that, companies are taking loans with a very high rate. Don't compare with the western part of the Europe. And after that, well, when they need the money, that banks are relending them, you know. Sometimes our government says that you see how, well, the ratio of a growth of assets, banking process is much more higher than the GDP. You know. Sometimes I'm surprised why it's growing so fast. You have a 20% growth in the banking assets and you have 2% growth in the economy, you know. So it's a bubble. And
Yep.
as being an economist, I feel that the bubble is coming, another bubble is coming. You know, and then when you go to these to those assets, to having a look to the quality, it's a relending, you know. It's But to my mind, also the blame is to the Basel III, having such a rising demands to the adequacy of capital. It doesn't help when the bubble will come, you know. And I would like to know your comments on that, you know, because there isn't any new business. And my second question is connected with SMEs, you know. We have had the industrial revolution, and nowadays we have a technological revolution. We know that during the industrial revolution, the economy was specialized. That's why manufacturing was developed, etc., etc. But nowadays, what is going nowadays? I can't understand. Are going these SMEs to increase their role? Because nowadays I see in the new technologies more integration than specialization. You know? Well, everywhere we are trying. Let's help these SMEs, greater special taxation, give them money, resources, etc., etc. They're growing up. But the main growth of the world's economy is coming from transnational corporations. So I would like to understand, these SMEs are to serve these transnational corporations, or nowadays we are going to transfer transnational corporations to serve these SMEs? Well, what's going on in fact? You know?
Well, at least in Southeastern Europe, there are no transnational corporations, and most of the companies are quite small, and there are national champions, of course, but there are no supranational champions and no companies that are known in the rest of the world. To a certain extent, I disagree with you about the fact that growth is being produced by the large companies. Actually, the SMEs in all over Europe actually account, in terms of numbers, to 99% of the companies. Sometimes that figure reaches 99.8% of the companies, and they produce no less than 60% of the GDP. So if we eliminate all SMEs in Germany, Germany would be just 1/3 of what it is now. The same is with the rest of the countries. At least in Bulgaria, they produce 67% of the GDP, being 98% of the companies. The SMEs are quite many in numbers, and none of them is systemically important, but altogether they are quite important for our economies, and we just can't neglect their figures and what they do. On top of that, the SMEs tend to be very innovative. Actually, most of the new technologies are being produced by small-sized companies, which are then acquired by large cap companies. For instance, Amazon is no longer a virtual bookstore. It has grown because it acquired many other companies, and of course it started many other businesses. The same is with Google, the same is with Microsoft. So the SMEs, the small companies, are important because they tend to be more innovative and they create growth, and they are further acquired by large companies. Addressing your further questions, I completely agree with you. Basel III and CRD4, that's the European directive that implements it within the borders of the European Union, are now overly restrictive. I definitely agree with that. Actually, to a certain extent, the Basel framework actually prevents the banks from normally funding the economies, and actually that type of restrictiveness actually impedes the growth of the SMEs. The banks can't normally perform their functions. Of course, it's pretty understandable why Basel III was created. It was supposed to address those issues that actually led to the financial crisis 10 years ago, but in a sense they were structured in a way that actually is drawing back the real economy by limiting the ability of the banks to fund it properly.
The lady.
Yes, you did not mention the Juncker plan. Juncker launched in 2015, I think, the backing by the European Investment Bank of loans by companies. Did it have an effect or not?
Well, when I heard about the Juncker plan and that it was supposed to work together with the European Investment Bank and more precisely about the so-called Project Bonds initiative, I was very enthusiastic at that time, but it obviously didn't work, or it didn't work too well. There are just a few examples of the implementation of that initiative all over Europe, and they were not that successful. At least in my country, I raised that issue a few times with the various government institutions, but the idea wasn't very well accepted, and it more or less it remained in the past.
Yeah.
Yep.
Another question? Yes. And then.
In relation to. Thank you for your presentation. I'm a little bit surprised by your response regarding technology or the SME in your case, because you say, if I heard you clear, you said that in your case, the technology is coming from SME to big company.
Now, some of the new technologies are coming from SMEs to the bigger companies, which further actually acquire their business.
Okay. Because as far as I understand, in the European Union, they are running a particular project to empower the SME by creating a bridge of information, technology and the knowledge information, bringing knowledge. Big company knowledge to SME. Mm-hmm. That's a project which are run by EU. Also, in many places in the developing country, we have this a problem of technology capability within SME. They are not competitive because of the knowledge and the technology incapability. And we are now trying to formulate a strategy to empower them technologically. And my question is, what do you think is the right strategy to empower them technology rather than just funding them? Because funding has been a song for ages. Everywhere is funding SME, but the money goes and disappears because in order to empower them, you must have to compete with the big company. What do you think is the right strategy?
The right long-term strategy is investing in their education. Many of the companies, many of the innovative companies are actually being launched by people who had previously worked with large cap companies but decided to basically step out and launch their own companies. So in other words, that's the right way. If we promote education, then we will have more capable SMEs.
The last question.
It's in relation to getting capital into the markets. It's a question of getting wider participation in society in the stock exchanges, buying shares, increasing numbers of transactions, the role of capital taxes in that in terms of not hitting people hard on the gains that they would make so that they would reinvest it and become more participatory stock market that was part of the Takev model in the UK with the privatizations.
Mm-hmm.
So in relation to both the question of privatizations providing that possibility and also the role of capital taxation and profits, to what extent you tax the profits. Are we seeing in the economies that you're acquainted with a maturing, if you like, of participation by ordinary people, rather than being seen as the elitist stockbroking operation by a small number of people in society?
Yeah, well, I think capital taxation is very important. At least in Bulgaria, we don't have a capital gains tax. It is very important for our equities market, and I think it should be exactly that way all over Europe. Capital gains shouldn't be taxed. The companies are taxed, but let's keep the capital gains tax exempt, and dividends should be also taxed at very low rates. For instance, in Bulgaria, it's just like 5%. When it comes to your first question, yes, again, I think it's very important to create those types of incentives for small and sized companies. I'm to a little bit uncertain how we can actually do it, and it's a matter of many regulatory initiatives. It's not just one. Maybe because we are quite short on time, we can continue in the break. Sorry.
Yeah,
Yep.
later.
Yep.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank very much my friend and colleague Ivan for his excellent presentation and for the sharp replies he has given to the difficult questions.